Welcome to day number 5 and game 5 of the World Chess Championship match between Gukesh and Ding Liren. Gukesh with the white pieces plays the move e4, and Ding again plays this French defense with the black pieces against white's e4. Interesting that Gukesh won round number 3 with the move d4, but then switches back to e4, which was where he actually lost against Ding in the first round. So let's see if Gukesh came up with something different and unique at the opening. After d4, we have d5, and Gukesh takes on d5. The exchange variation of the French defense, and by many, this is seen as a kind of boring type of opening where you have a symmetrical pawn structure, white is up a tempo, but it can be quite rich in a lot of details. And it's a very interesting approach by Gukesh in such a high-level match to go for an opening which is generally considered um, quite drawish. Is this because he was able to outplay Ding in an endgame in a previous match in game number 3? Let's see what he had kind of stirred up for Ding in this game. Knight f3, knight to f6, bishop to d3, pawn c5. The c5 pawn, if captured, would leave black with an isolated pawn on d4. However, there are certain cases where an isolated pawn is a weakness, and there are other cases where it's a strength. Typically, it's a strength when you're getting a lot of activity um, on the adjacent files of the pawn and the ability to use the squares directly behind the pawn in order to maneuver. This is also an interesting position. It's been played several times before with black having some good results, getting a lot of activity and dynamic play for this long-term weakness on the d5 square. Okay, in the game, after c5, we have pawn c3 and pawn c4. Very interesting choice as well. The pawn is quite committal to advance, releasing the tension on d4. The downside to this is that if white is able to organize somehow the bishop getting to f3, this knight getting to the e3 square, then the longer the game goes, there will be this problem of the d5 pawn. After bishop c2, we have bishop d6, queen to e2, queen to e7, captures and captures. And I think with this capture, Gukesh is saying to Ding, I'm going to try to head into an endgame where some of the decisions that you made previously were a bit off, and it's possible that you might have those same problems today. After castles, rook to e8, rook to e1, king to f8, rook takes, king takes, and bishop g5, threatening to take the knight and double the pawns. Take potentially. Sorry, take. So black plays knight to d7. We have knight d2, h6, bishop h4, and knight to h5, and very natural move, rook e1 check, and king to f8. All right. This is really the turning point, I think, for the potential for white to show his cards and show what he's playing for. What kind of middle game plans can white come up with to get a small edge in the position? So Gukesh plays the move g4 here, and I'm trying to understand what he is playing for with this move. Okay, clearly the idea is to attack the knight, and after the knight moves back, we can just solidify the pawn and say we have some space advantage on the king side. But the most natural move here is knight to f4. And after knight to f4, the only reasonable idea here is to play the move bishop g3 and pin the knight to the bishop on d6. But if white's playing for this position, if they're not able to take advantage of the position tactically, then this pawn move just critically weakened the f4 square for the entire rest of the game. So I'm really thinking that from one perspective, from a learning perspective, we can understand that Gukesh is trying to play concretely, and his ability to calculate and find concrete details is really what separates him from a lot of players and his excellent ability in that regard. But from another point of view, This d5 pawn is a glaring weakness. And if white is able to transfer the bishop to f3, bring the knight to f1 and knight to e3, then white will have sizable pressure on the d5 pawn, and then maybe from that point, he can try to create some tactical play. Okay, in the game he plays pawn g4, we have knight to f4 and bishop g3. Knight to b6, both knight f6 here and knight b6 are fine. Knight b6 is slightly more accurate with potentially an attack against the b2 pawn later if the bishop ever moves. We have knight b6, the pawn on g4 is hanging, and pawn to g5. You can't play h3 now because of knight takes with a check on h3. So g5 has to be played. We have captures, captures, and bishop d7. Knight back to f3, rook to e8, and knight to e5. Ding captures on e5. He trades his dark squared bishop for the knight. So before putting this on the board, let's try to understand why he's trading the bishop for the knight. Okay, the first thing is that the knight is hanging on f4, and this has to be dealt with. The bishop on d7 potentially as well, but the knight on f4. So let's say we go knight g6. Well, we don't like that because our pawn structure is weak. It hits with a check, and then the bishop on d6 loses. For example, knight g6, we can take even with the bishop here. It's probably still good, but takes and game over. If knight to h3 check, we can simply play king g2. We're threatening the bishop on d7, and therefore the knight is hanging. So bishop takes now allows white to take back with a piece rather than the pawn. And if you, what else? Move knight d3, you lose the pawn. Yeah, so really not too much. Knight to h5. Then again, the bishop on d6 is a problem. So we have knight takes on d7, followed by bishop takes on d6 with check. So the only move is to capture on e5, and Gukesh has a choice. And I'd like to ask what you would play in this position. Would you take with the rook? Would you take with the pawn? And kind of what is your reasoning and calculation? And I'm asking this for a specific reason as well. Okay, so Gukesh took with the pawn in this case, and it was an inaccurate move. The best move is to take with the rook, and structurally, this keeps the pawn structure intact. Black could take back and then force this weakening of the structure again, and then the knight moves to safety. So we have a situation where Gukesh is making a decision based on whether or not he wants to keep the rooks on the board, and I think this decision was one of ambition. So the reason he captured with the pawn is to be able to keep some extra material on the board. Having this rook on the board is going to give him opportunities, especially with the two bishops, that otherwise wouldn't be possible. But from the other hand, after what was played, which we'll see, there are some critical weaknesses after we take with the pawn and allowing black to keep the rook on the board. And that is going to be the pressure on the e-file, and as well as, let's see, potentially having a passed pawn in the center of the board, as we'll see. So d takes e5, a slight inaccuracy by Gukesh, playing for some ambition rather than trading off the rooks here and getting a more simplified position. So the reason it's inaccurate is exactly exactly how Ding plays. He plays knight d3, attacking the pawn on b2. We have captures, captures, and pawn to f3, and Ding plays the move knight to c4. So in this moment, Ding played pretty much perfectly, and really his only chance to win the game here is to play the move knight to a4, putting pressure on the b2 pawn and c3 pawn. The knight does a fantastic job on the a4 square, asking a question: how are you going to deal with the pressure on b2 for the rest of the game? You don't really want to defend with the rook passively on the b1 square, and then that extra rook that you had is only used for defensive role. But Ding decides to play the move knight to c4. And I was listening to Magnus talk about this position in his recap of the game, to get a better understanding of how to play these endgames myself. And he said he didn't really, let's say like knight c4 was an expected approach by Ding. He wasn't surprised that that Ding would go into this knight c4 move because of the way that he plays in the past, which is just very, very solidly and at a very high level as well, not taking any risks. But this also shows that maybe Ding wasn't prepared for a fight for today. Um, he's playing very solid moves, and maybe he wasn't ready to play this battle with the move knight a4, potentially getting a longer game and maybe taking some risks. So after knight c4, we have captures, captures, and rook to e4. The rook is attacking the pawn on c4, and after bishop c6, Gukesh plays the move rook to d4. If you take right away, then after we have two options here. We can take back right away, or we can play the move rook d8. We may have some problems with stopping this pawn. So Gukesh plays an interesting in-between move, rook to d4, asking the question, are you going to take on f3, at which point the king will be fast enough to hit the bishop and then also stop the pawn, giving the white rook time to take the pawn on c4. So after rook d4, we have bishop takes on f3, king to f2, and bishop c6. And again, Ding is playing an approach which is very, very safe, but given the opportunity, you'd think that he would want to take some risks. And let's say not even take some risks, but this is an opportunity for him to try to play for an edge. After the move bishop h5, we're threatening pawn to d2, so if the rook takes, pawn d2 wins the game. The rook d4 move doesn't work, and the king as well cannot really approach the pawn. If rook takes, pawn push, the king is not able to get to the e1 square. The rook coming to d4 is a bit too slow, and the bishop stops the king as well. So it's really surprising that he played bishop c6 in this position when he could have played bishop h5, keeping the tension and giving him the possibility of having a connected pass pawn in the endgame. And okay, if king d2 is played, maybe we have time to save the pawn on c4. Bishop c6, very safe move. Nothing wrong with this move, but lacking some ambition from Ding. After rook takes, we have rook d8, rook d4, takes. We have opposite colored bishop endgame. I've had this type of position even up 3 pawns, and it's just not going to always win. After b3, king to e7, king to e3, king e6, king takes, pawn g6, king c3, pawn a6. The kings now just shuffle back and forth, and we have a draw. All right, so game number 5, no fireworks here, but from Black's perspective, we have 2 French defenses for Black and a win and a draw with the Black pieces for Ding and the French. So I don't think Gukesh is going to play e4 without maybe some serious different play in the coming rounds. I expect d4 openings from Gukesh. That would be the best approach from my opinion. And we have Gukesh with the black pieces tomorrow. Ding hasn't been able to put up some pressure against Gukesh as black. Okay, he actually got some play in that previous game, playing a very interesting opening, which didn't aim for, let's say, a huge advantage, but very small strategic advantage, which I also expect will be happening tomorrow. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's recap and stay tuned for tomorrow's video.